the games of Nintendo 64.
Did you ever get in or get out? If you're in, you should be GetN N Ncyclopedia. Hey everyone, John here. We're looking at another book from Scottish video game journalist Chris Scullion. This time it's the N64 Encyclopedia. Scullion has previously written the NES and SNES encyclopedias, as well as the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Encyclopedia, with encyclopedias for the Dreamcast and the Game Boy on the way at the time of this video. He certainly knows his retro video games, so what has he written about the games for Nintendo's 64-bit fun machine? Let's start by checking the scope of the book. The subtitle is Every Game Released for the Nintendo 64. Featured here are N64 games that are released in North America, PAL regions including Europe and Australia, and Japan. Yes, that's right, Japanese games, including games for the 64DD. Unlike the NES and SNES encyclopedias, which were limited to the West, the N64 Encyclopedia includes games from Nintendo's homeland, because there aren't as many games overall as the earlier Nintendo consoles, and in a twist, Japan got way fewer games than the rest of the world this time around. To be fair, the earlier two Nintendo encyclopedias say NES and SNES, and don't say Famicom and Super Famicom, while Nintendo 64 is a global name. So it works out quite well. So, how many games are in these 256 pages? There are 404 games here. 296 North American, 241 for PAL regions, and 208 Japanese. I have said previously that Japan has exactly 100 fewer games than North America, a nice round number. But that sounds like there should be 196 games. The reason there are 208 Japanese games in this book, which is 12 more, is because of the 2 upgraded Tile re-releases of Super Mario 64 and Wave Race 64, as well as the 10 64DD games. If you Google how many 64DD games are there, it says there are 9 games, but there are 10 listings in this book, as the RANDnet disc, which is the dial-up utility disc, is included here. Though the Western games and multi-regional games are listed together, the Japanese exclusives have their own section, which makes sense considering their review lengths, as we'll see later. There really aren't any unlicensed games for the Nintendo 64, so there's no concern about whether or not they are here. While verifying this, I learned there are some hacks, like Ronaldinho's Soccer 64, but hacks have never been within the scope of these encyclopedias. Then there's 40 Winks, a PlayStation game but also intended for, yet unreleased on, the Nintendo 64, and later found new life as an aftermarket release. Though, both cancelled games and aftermarket games have also never been featured in these books. 248 games appear in more than one region. Games get one entry even if they are released in multiple regions, as that's what these flags and check marks indicate at the top here. It's not surprising for there to be minor changes, and even title changes, between regions, but still be considered the same game, which is the case for every video game encyclopedia that I've read. But sometimes there are exceptions, and here, the 3 International Superstar Soccer games, as they are known in North America and Europe, are considered separate from 4 of the GQ soccer games in Japan due to having a different selection of teams. Also, Mia Hamm's Soccer 64 is separate from Michael Owen's WLS 2000 for the same reason, besides one being women's soccer and the other being men's. Conveniently and coincidentally, these 2 are on the same page as they are next to each other alphabetically. And then we crank it up to 11, with FIFA Soccer 64 and J League Live 64. The regional separation of game variants like these are judgment calls, so they aren't right or wrong. But if you recall from before, it continues with the complications with soccer games that I noticed when reviewing the various encyclopedias for the Super NES. Why is it always soccer? If these 11 soccer games were combined into 5 entries, then the whole N64 library would be 398 games, a little shy of a neat 400. But anyway, there are 404 entries in this book, and an error 404 if you look for 40 Winks. Speaking of 4s, unlike the NES and SNES encyclopedias, where many of the games only get a quarter page, many more games here in the N64 Encyclopedia get half or full pages. 128 games get a full page, 156 get a half page, and 120 get a quarter page. It seems like a sort of even split, but then again, the quarter page reviews are for all but 4 of the Japanese games, and the only Western ones quartered up are the generic yearly sports games. Except for NFL Blitz Special Edition, but it still counts even though it doesn't have a year in the title. So if you only play English language games and don't care much for annually revised sports games, then you're in luck, as every N64 game you are likely to be interested in gets, at minimum, half a page. Even the infamous Superman gets a full page. The 4 Japanese games that do get a half page instead of a quarter are ones that even English-speaking gamers may have heard of, including Doshin the Giant and SimCity 64, both for the 64DD, and Dobutsu no Mori, or Animal Forest, the precursor to Animal Crossing, and Sin and Punishment, which the rest of the world can now officially experience on the Nintendo Switch's N64 app. Though I think the quarter-page entries are short in the NES and SNES encyclopedias, and they are still just as short here, but they are fewer in number, so the average length of entries is not an issue for this book. Scullion captured all the screenshots himself, sometimes quite evidently so. There is one screenshot for each quarter and half page review, and 2 for the full page reviews. 1 or 2 may not be many, but at least they are big. This encyclopedia series stands out from other similar books by having one interesting fact for every game. Out of the 404 entries, I made note of 96 particularly interesting ones while preparing this review, which is pretty good, as that's almost a quarter. Your mileage will vary, but I feel any of them should be fascinating to somebody. While this video won't show all of the facts that I like, lest I spoil all of the fun, you'll see some examples, and you can try to guess which games they belong to. The fact can be fun trivia or a tidbit of info that might not necessarily fit into the flow of the review. They can be about differences in regional variants, or codes or instructions on how to unlock secrets. Some of them are not about that particular N64 release, but about its ports on other platforms, or the series as a whole, or another entry in the series. Or it could be about whatever the game is based on, like the original show, toy, manga, or sport. They can be tangential and may just barely relate, but they are all at least a little compelling. I was intrigued about learning of the massive rant known as the Tetris rant inside the new Tetris, how Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey could have had fatalities like in Mortal Kombat, and what Jack and Beans refers to at the start of Pokemon Snap. When reading this from cover to cover, each time I turned the page, I would often be tempted to read all the facts across both pages before reading any of the reviews. Scullion's journalistic background is evident here, as he has done a lot of research that extends beyond merely playing the games. There are many sports games where he talks about whether or not they are licensed to use actual team and player names, something he even references himself in NHL Blades of Steel 99. Despite being in the UK, he is familiar with not only North American sports teams, but also professional wrestling when talking about the various WCW and WWF games. The first couple paragraphs of the reviews of any of the F1 racing games contain more than the entirety of my Formula 1 racing knowledge prior to reading this. And he certainly knows about cars, as seen in the entry for Roadsters. There are a few instances of regional differences being discussed, besides those in the facts, like F1 pole position's draw distance, or the different voice actors for Gex in Gex 64 Into the Gecko. And though the Japanese write-ups are generally smaller, he doesn't skimp on his research. I was impressed to learn how PD Ultraman Battle Coliseum 64 uses the transfer pack on any Game Boy game to generate a character, sort of like what Monster Rancher did on the PlayStation by using other discs. And it's not only knowledge about just the game itself, but about its series, like counting the previous games in the Ridge Racer and Road Rash series, or how Killer Instinct Gold compares to its arcade counterpart, Killer Instinct 2. So it's more than the content of the game, but the context in history. Like in his other books, Scullion has a wry sense of humor. He takes any opportunity to inject some wit and whimsy, including puns. In Biofreaks, he writes that you can render your opponents completely armless, and that in Castlevania, the stakes are high. He sometimes apologizes for these, but we know he's not sorry at all. He imagines that Ken Griffey Jr. has a passion for mollusks, just to set up a joke for Slugfest, and is a Nintendo 64 fan and wanting more than just Mario when he writes about the gothic horror of nightmare creatures. If you enjoy puns, dad jokes, and dry humor, then you will appreciate his attempts at adding amusement, whether awkward or assured.
Killer Combo!
Well, I've already talked about the good stuff already. The many fascinating facts, the good lengths of each entry, the big screenshots, the well-researched information, and his brand of humor that I legitimately appreciate. These are on par with his other books. And this time, Japanese games are now covered, and specifically here, the 64DD as well. Another change from the NES and SNES encyclopedias is that full-page entries get a second screenshot instead of box art. While I do like seeing box art, it is more consistent for there to just be screenshots for all games, plus it avoids having to pick which regional box art to represent. If we want to go beyond the series, I can quickly compare the N64 Encyclopedia to Geeksline Publishing's The Nintendo 64 Anthology, which I can't believe has already been years since I reviewed it. But despite the difference in the book sizes, there's actually more written per game in the N64 Encyclopedia. So if you like to read about just the games, that's great, and yet the book is still a non-intimidating size and won't break the bank or your back. But then we have the
Combo Breaker!
Which is what I will call the not so great stuff, the things I don't prefer, the minor criticisms. One reason why there is lots to read about each game is because there's not much else to read about beyond these. Sure, there's a foreword, an introduction, and the history of the Nintendo 64. These are all short and imageless. At least the NES and SNES encyclopedias had some pictures here. Aside from a few magazine ads from the era of the Nintendo 64, there's just a one-page introduction to the games, another one for the Japanese exclusives, and an index. That's all there is besides the main content, the write-ups for each game. While that is the case for the other encyclopedia books by Scullion, true to the focus of just talking about every game with a no-nonsense approach that can certainly be appreciated, I do feel like there was a missed opportunity to say a bit more. Perhaps a page or two for accessories, especially since the Nintendo 64 didn't have very many, like the Rumble Pack, Transfer Pack, Expansion Pack, and certainly the Game Shark, since at least a couple of the fun facts mention it. Taking a cue from the Play It Loud series of Game Boys, the Nintendo 64 might have been the first major home console to come in many collectible colors with its Fantastic series, not to mention the range of colors for the standard controllers. So maybe there could have at least been a gallery of those? I'm not asking for it to be like the Nintendo 64 Anthology and have literally 99 pages of deep history and interviews before even getting to the games, but, you know, a little something more about this console would have been nice. As mentioned earlier, each review has at least one screenshot, and now two for the full-page ones. Though it would be at the risk of making them smaller, I think it would be nicer to have more than just one or two shots from a game, which is often never really enough to properly represent a game in my opinion. And I guess I have been calling them reviews, but these write-ups aren't that judgmental. There's no criticism of Quest 64? Like, really? Other books of this type by other writers always have a rating system, or icons, or something to show which games are better or worse than the others. For the NES and SNES encyclopedias, I can at least assume that the better games are the ones that get more coverage. If you've seen my review of the SNES Encyclopedia, you would have seen that 29 games got a full page, and they are a very good selection of the best games for the Super NES. So therefore, a full page review must mean it's a favorite. However, if I were to make that assumption here, that wouldn't be accurate. I'm pretty sure that the 128 games that get a page themselves aren't all top tier when there are only 404 games in total. I mentioned Superman already, but even Carmageddon 64, Earthworm Jim 3D, Duo Heroes? It's only because Scullion allows this much space for so many games, which I do appreciate, but then it feels even more like there should have been some way to tell which games are worth our time and which are trash. Maybe Scullion thinks an encyclopedia isn't a place to judge, but every other book series that cover games rate them, or at least indicate the iconic games. Occasionally, there are references to an expectation that a reader is reading these encyclopedia entries in alphabetical order. In one such instance, he explains at the start of WWF Warzone that he dispenses with alphabetical order so that the 4 WWF games can be described in chronological order. Maybe I'm not a huge wrestling fan, but is this really so important that it is worth breaking encyclopedia rules for? If that's the case, why wouldn't something more story-rich, like, you know, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time be put before The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask? If you're making exceptions for alphabetical order, why not this one? It'd just be one page over. But no, he references the appropriateness of time travel being a central mechanic of Majora's Mask, that it appears, as it does alphabetically, before Ocarina of Time. So, two of the best games in one of the best adventure game series ever can't make an exception. But wrestling? Yep, gotta put that in order. Okay, it's not a big deal, just odd and a bit inconsistent. There is also inconsistency with multi-regional games that have a different title between North America and PAL regions. I would have assumed that being in the UK, Scullion might prefer to use European names. A couple of examples are that you will find Deadly Arts listed as GASP! Fighter's Next Stream, and Goemon's Great Adventure as Mystical Ninja 2 starring Goemon. There are a couple more besides these, also favoring European names, but it also goes the other way. Star Fox 64 is listed under its North American name, despite being known as Lilat Wars there. It could be because Star Fox 64 is a big name and would probably be better recognized as a Star Fox game. Same with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater instead of Tony Hawk Skateboarding. But then there's Twisted Edge Extreme Snowboarding, which keeps the extreme, which is apparently too much excitement for Europeans to handle. Scullion himself makes this joke. But why the inconsistency? Perhaps there's some reason behind each of the exceptions, but I don't know what they are. I think he should have prioritized one region and stuck with it throughout. Now, I did say that Scullion is very knowledgeable, so of course I figuratively scratch my head when he doesn't mention something that I think is obvious but so noteworthy. In the entry for Pokemon Snap, there's not a single mention of the Pokemon Snap stations found at Blockbuster video locations where you can get your in-game photographs of Pokemon printed off onto little stickers. This was a huge feature of the game, so these photo stickers shouldn't have been glossed over. See what I did there? At least the sticker printing was briefly mentioned in the entry for Pokemon Stadium, even though it wasn't quite as prominent a feature. Another oddity is the lack of a mention of the Star Wars Shadows of the Empire video game being just one part of the multimedia project by Lucasfilm that includes a novel, a comic series, toys, and even a soundtrack, despite there being no film. The central part of this project is Steve Perry's book, which was the only Star Wars novel I ever bought. But I probably sold it, so enjoy whatever image of it I edit in here. But anyway, I would have certainly accepted a simpler explanation of the game being based on the book. But nope, nothing like that. Of course, I don't expect Scullion to have written every possible thing about every single game, but Star Wars and Pokemon are not niche things at all, and yet these 2 points should have warranted a mention. The omission of information might not be a concern, but outright errors would be. Thankfully, there aren't many, but you know I'm going to point out the ones that I found. It says here that Mortal Kombat Trilogy introduced brutalities, but they actually originated in Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3.
Brutality.
Jet Force Gemini's review describes Lupus as a dog in a small spaceship. What? That's clearly a space suit, or components of his cyborg body, and partway through he gets upgraded to a tank, but I still wouldn't call it a spaceship. Speaking of not recognizing animals, the write-up for Mickey Speedway USA seems to imply that the longtime Disney character Pete is a dog, but he's a cat. Killer Instinct Gold's Fact says the 2013 Killer Instinct game is an Xbox One exclusive, but it's also on PC. And the Japanese train simulator, Denshin to Go 64, says it has a recent Switch and PS2 title, but he meant PS4. And Automobili Lamborghini doesn't have a checkmark by the Japanese flag, but it should. However, this could be considered a typo, as the index at the back does list the Japanese version, Super Speed Race 64, referencing Automobili Lamborghini, so it was indeed known about. Speaking of typos, I did find some for sure, from Conky's Bad Fur Day on the foreword right at the start of the book, to missing or misplaced commas, to inconsistent spacing and punctuating of biofreaks. Game Shark should have a capital S, Dex Drive's second D should be capitalized as well, and Pokeballs should be 2 words. Okay, I guess I'm getting pedantic again.
Supreme victory!
Though I may be insistent in pointing out some of the errors that I find in any book, these ones here in the N64 Encyclopedia are truly minor and relatively few, so compared against the many other overviews which are flawless and well researched and well written, we actually have a very good Nintendo 64 book here. The library isn't as big as other consoles, so there's a lot written here per game that you can learn about in a normal sized book and not a massive tome like some of the other encyclopedias I've read. Also, can someone suggest a better term than massive tome? I've used that too much. Anyway, massive or otherwise, and unlike the NES and Super NES, there currently aren't many similar books at the moment for the Nintendo 64. I guess that sounds like I'm recommending it by default, but it's not like you can be disappointed by this, as long as you want to read about just Nintendo 64 games. If you want more screenshots or information other than the cartridges, that may be a little lacking. Even though other N64 books are likely to come out, you'll only find Scullion's sense of humor here, so that might count for something. Overall, I'll give the N64 Encyclopedia a 4 out of 5. You can buy the N64 Encyclopedia from Amazon, which is what I did, but it's also available at Indigo/Chapters, Barnes & Noble, and even Walmart *. That's it for this book review. If you want to see me review more books or similar game-related videos, don't forget to subscribe. At the time that I filmed this, I only had 930 subscribers, but as of a few days ago, I just surpassed 1,000 subscribers. That's a lot in a relatively short amount of time. So, welcome to you new subscribers, and thank you to everyone, long time or more recent, that have ever subscribed to me. It's what keeps me making these videos. If you are among the 95% of my audience that haven't subscribed, consider doing so if you want to see more videos like this in your YouTube feed. It really means a lot. Thanks. So until the next one, keep gaming, keep reading, and keep geeking out. See ya! I have said previously that Japan has...
That's on bloopers.
I have to breathe. Combo breaker. Okay, now I gotta change my super.
Okay, stop.